What if the one place no one was ever supposed to look was finally opened? Not a courtroom, not a palace, not a leaked email or a hot mic moment. A storage unit. Let that sink in for a second. Because storage units are supposed to be boring, forgotten, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, broken lamps, maybe a suitcase no one wants to deal with anymore. They are places where the past goes to sleep quietly. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Until it doesn't. 5 minutes ago, according to sources close to the situation, a storage unit in California connected to Meghan Markle was opened under circumstances no one expected to turn into a breaking news moment. No flashing lights, no dramatic announcement, just a metal door rolling upward and a silence so heavy that people reportedly froze in place. And here's the question no one can answer yet. What do you do when something hidden refuses to stay hidden? This isn't gossip. This isn't a rumor born on social media. And this isn't a story that started with scandal in mind. It started with paperwork, missed payments, legal technicalities, a process so routine that no one thought it would matter. Until it did. Because when that door opened, whatever was inside didn't just raise eyebrows. It reportedly forced people in the room to look at each other and ask a question that no one wanted to say out loud. Should we even be seeing this? And that's where this story really begins. For years, the public narrative around Meghan Markle has been tightly controlled, carefully curated. Every appearance dissected, every interview debated, every gesture analyzed to exhaustion. Supporters see strength and reinvention. Critics see manipulation and performance. But both sides agree on one thing. Nothing about her life is accidental, which makes this discovery so unsettling. Because storage units are messy, they're unfiltered. They're where things go when they don't fit the story anymore. Ask yourself this. If everything in your life matched the image you presented to the world, what would you need to hide? That question hung in the air the moment the unit was opened. Sources say the people present didn't rush in. No one grabbed a phone. No one spoke. There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you something is wrong before you even know what it is. A pause where instinct kicks in and your body reacts before your brain catches up. Have you ever had that feeling? That moment where your stomach drops, but you don't know why yet? That's what witnesses describe. And here's where the story takes a turn. This unit wasn't opened because someone was curious. It wasn't a tabloid stunt. It wasn't even part of a larger investigation at first. It was triggered by a technical process that happens every single day across California. Thousands of units are opened every year for the same reason. But this one was different. Because of whose name was on the paperwork. And because of what allegedly wasn't supposed to be there. Now pause for a moment and think about timing. Why now? Why not years ago? Why not quietly emptied, transferred, erased? That's one of the first contradictions that investigators reportedly noticed. According to insiders, this unit had been maintained just enough to avoid attention, but neglected enough to fall into procedural danger. Almost like it was forgotten. Or worse, left behind on purpose. That raises a disturbing possibility. Was someone supposed to come back for it? As the door lifted, the smell of dust and still air rushed out. Not decay, not something obvious. Just the unmistakable scent of time, of things sitting untouched, of stories waiting without an audience. And then there were the boxes. Not random, not chaotic, stacked, labeled, organized in a way that didn't match the idea of abandoned storage. That's when the first person reportedly stepped back. You see, when you expect junk and you see intention instead, your brain starts racing. Organization means planning. Planning means foresight. And foresight means someone cared about what would happen later. Why would someone carefully organize items they never intended to retrieve? That question alone changes everything. At this point, no one knew the full scope of what they were looking at. But they knew enough to understand that this wasn't just personal overflow. This wasn't seasonal storage or memorabilia from a previous life. This was deliberate. And deliberate always has a reason. One source described the atmosphere as professionally uncomfortable. Not panic, not chaos, something colder. The kind of discomfort that comes when you realize you've crossed an invisible line. And then came the second realization. Some of the contents didn't align with public timelines. Dates didn't match. Labels contradicted known events. Items appeared to exist where they shouldn't have. Let me ask you something. When someone's story changes, What usually changes first? Their words. But physical evidence? That's harder to rewrite. That's why this matters. Because what was allegedly found in that storage unit doesn't just challenge opinions. It challenges sequences. It challenges narratives that have been repeated so often they've hardened into truth. And here's where the stakes jump. At a certain point, protocol changes. What begins as a routine opening becomes something else entirely. According to insiders, there was a moment when someone quietly said a single sentence that altered the tone of the room. We need to notify someone. That's not something you say lightly. That's not something you say over old clothes or broken furniture. That's something you say when what you're seeing carries consequences. Legal ones, reputational ones, possibly historical ones. And suddenly, this wasn't about Meghan Markle, the public figure. It was about Meghan Markle, the unknown variable. Because no matter where you stand on her, no matter what you believe, this discovery introduces a problem no PR team can spin immediately. You can explain words away. You can contextualize interviews. You can dismiss anonymous sources. But sealed boxes? Stored evidence? Items preserved in silence? Those don't argue. They wait. And the longer they wait, the louder they become. As word began to quietly move through private channels, one thing became clear very quickly. This was not supposed to reach the public. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Which raises the most unsettling question of all. If this had stayed closed, what else would have stayed hidden with it? And remember, we're still at the beginning. Because what was seen in those first minutes wasn't even the most troubling part. According to multiple accounts, the real shock came later. After the initial inventory. After the first calls. After someone noticed something that made no sense at all. Something that didn't belong in a storage unit. Something that made one witness reportedly say, under their breath, "This changes everything." Not just any door. Not a back entrance to a mansion, a palace wing, or a VIP room. A metal, corrugated door with a faded number painted on the front, tucked away in a quiet corner of a California storage facility. The kind of place most people pass by without a second thought. The kind of place that whispers stories of the past, but rarely the present. Until now. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Dust gathered on the frame, sunlight reflecting off streaked metal panels. But the moment investigators, lawyers, and a small team of witnesses stepped closer, the air shifted. There was weight in the stillness, a sense that the room beyond that door had a story it was desperate to tell, and had been waiting for the right moment to do so. No one expected anything remarkable when the unit was first rented years ago. A simple lease, a modest payment schedule, and a promise of privacy. That's all anyone knew, or thought they knew. But inside that metal cage, sources say, items had been carefully preserved, organized with intention, almost as if the person who stored them anticipated that one day, someone would come looking. And yet, for years, it sat untouched. The staff at the facility knew it existed. Some had even seen the renter during rare visits. But no one paid it any mind beyond the mundane. A unit in a quiet corner, far from the bustling rows of overflowing spaces, often overlooked. It was the kind of place people forget until fate, or legal necessity, forces them to remember. The first hint that this unit was different came when the door was scheduled to be opened. Routine procedure. Unpaid fees had reached a threshold that allowed the facility to reclaim access. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple administrative action that usually results in an inventory, some paperwork, and the occasional auction notice. But from the moment the first latch was turned, it became clear that this was not a standard unit. The lock clicked, the metal groaned as the door rolled upward, and a rush of stale air escaped. Witnesses describe it as if the air itself carried the weight of secrets. The scent of decades, not decay, not rot, but the stillness of items left untouched. Silence followed. A tense, deliberate silence, where everyone in the room instinctively slowed, their movements cautious, almost reverent. What made it unusual wasn't just what was inside, but how it was arranged. Boxes stacked neatly, labeled with precision. Containers lined in perfect rows, as though each item had been cataloged, not for convenience, but for a purpose. Imagine expecting chaos, and instead finding order. That's the moment the first seed of suspicion grew. Because when you expect mess, you adjust your expectations. When you find meticulous arrangement instead, your brain starts asking questions it wasn't prepared to answer. Who organized this? Why? And most importantly, what were they hiding? Insiders described the atmosphere as professionally tense. Not fear exactly, not panic, but a weight that pressed down with a quiet authority, demanding attention. Every movement, every sound echoed differently than it should have. Even the creak of the metal door seemed louder in that charged space. The usual banter and idle conversation that accompanies routine inventory was absent. People spoke in whispers, their eyes scanning, cataloging, and connecting details that seemed almost deliberately placed to be discovered. The labels on the boxes were particularly intriguing. Dates that contradicted public records. Notes that seemed innocuous at first glance. But, when pieced together, suggested timelines no one outside this circle was supposed to know. It was as if someone had constructed a narrative that only those willing to pay attention and think critically could decode. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some of the boxes contained items that, according to witnesses, had no business being stored in such a unit. Official documents? Possibly. Memorabilia? Perhaps. But certain pieces were described as anomalous, the kind of material that makes experts pause, scratch their heads, and quietly say to each other, "This shouldn't exist here." Imagine the juxtaposition. You walk into a place you think holds forgotten furniture and boxes of old clothes. Instead, you find evidence that challenges public timelines, questions narratives you've taken for granted, and presents possibilities you never considered. That's what witnesses claim they experienced. A puzzle, meticulously arranged, with pieces that didn't quite fit the public image of anyone involved. The initial inventory alone was enough to trigger an unspoken protocol. Phones were pulled out, calls made. Certain individuals who were not originally part of the opening were quietly summoned. Legal teams assembled. What had begun as routine procedure was escalating, minute by minute, into something far more serious. But what truly set this discovery apart wasn't the items themselves. It was the implications. Every neatly stacked box suggested foresight. Every label implied intention. And every contradiction with the known record posed questions no one wanted to answer publicly. Pause and consider this for a moment. How often do small actions, like renting a storage unit, carry consequences that ripple far beyond their intended purpose? How often does a locked door quietly hold pieces of a narrative that, if exposed, could rewrite stories carefully curated for years? According to insiders, that was precisely the feeling in the room. An understanding that the unit, its contents, and the choices made by whoever stored these items were all part of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that could challenge public perceptions, force legal scrutiny, and ignite media speculation. Then there were the minor but striking details. The absence of dust on certain boxes. The careful placement of fragile containers. The seeming avoidance of any chaotic, careless arrangement that would indicate spontaneity. Everything was deliberate. Nothing was accidental. Witnesses reportedly exchanged glances as they began to piece together the order and arrangement. Subtle patterns emerged. Certain items were placed next to others in ways that seemed meaningful, almost like breadcrumbs for someone who knew exactly how to follow them. And that's when the room's first silent alarm bells rang. Because meticulous arrangement in a space that no one should be looking at raises a chilling question. Who expected it to be opened? And for what purpose? Experts in archival handling and investigative research explain that deliberate preservation like this often signals anticipation. Anticipation of scrutiny. Anticipation of legal challenges. Anticipation of revelation. These are not the habits of someone careless or disorganized. They are the habits of someone who plans for the moment when secrets might be exposed. It's worth pausing to reflect on the irony here. A storage unit, something most people consider mundane, almost invisible, is the stage for revelations that ripple far beyond its four walls. The simplest act of opening a metal door can trigger questions about timing, intention, and accountability that no casual observer is prepared to answer. And that's exactly what happened here. Sources describe a moment when someone in the room, after cataloging the initial items, quietly said, "We need to notify someone." That sentence, simple and brief, shifted the tone completely. From routine to consequential. From curiosity to serious concern. Because in spaces like this, words are weighted. They carry the authority of protocol, law, and professional judgment. And once that sentence was spoken, the trajectory of the day, and perhaps the story itself, was irrevocably changed. Questions began to multiply faster than anyone could answer them. Why was this unit organized so carefully? Why now? Why did certain items contradict public timelines? And perhaps most troubling, what else might still be hidden, just out of view, waiting for someone else to unlock it? According to witnesses, the team paused. Each individual processed the implications in their own way. Some noted the legal risks. Others noted the reputational stakes. And some simply tried to make sense of what appeared to be a living puzzle, quietly demanding answers it had no intention of revealing immediately. That is why this storage unit, a seemingly unremarkable space, became the epicenter of attention. Because hidden in the ordinary, you sometimes find the extraordinary. Because the mundane can hide secrets that challenge everything you thought you knew. And because when someone finally decides, or is forced, to look, what's revealed can change not just a story, but perceptions, histories, and legacies. By the time the first full sweep of the unit was completed, one thing was clear: this was never just a storage space. It was a narrative waiting to be decoded. A story in boxes, sealed and preserved, each piece pointing to questions that had no easy answers. And according to sources, the most significant revelations were still ahead. Hidden in the far corner, behind a stack of boxes, waiting for the right moment to surface. Because the truth, it seems, is patient. It waits for doors to be opened, for eyes to see, and for the world to realize that some secrets, once exposed, cannot be ignored. And as the team stepped back, taking stock of the first impressions, one thought hung in the air. What comes next could change everything. They say the law is predictable, routine, procedural. You pay your bills, follow the rules, and life goes on without incident. Most of the time, that's true. But sometimes, the law doesn't just resolve disputes. It becomes the spark that ignites revelations nobody could have predicted. That's exactly what happened here. The story of how this storage unit came to be opened isn't glamorous. It didn't involve spies or paparazzi lurking in shadows. It began with something mundane, a notice of overdue payments. A small stack of invoices that had quietly gone unpaid. Normally, this would have resulted in a simple administrative action, a polite letter, perhaps a late fee, maybe an auction if the unit remained delinquent. But in this case, the routine became extraordinary. The unit's lease had been maintained for years with irregular payments, a fact that should have triggered attention long before this moment. Instead, it had flown under the radar, carefully ignored, or perhaps deliberately overlooked. It wasn't until a specific date last month that the facility's legal team realized the delinquency had reached the threshold that allowed access. That tiny procedural detail would become the catalyst for everything that followed. Here's where it gets interesting. According to insiders, the legal notice wasn't just a formality. It was the kind of paperwork that sets in motion multiple cascading consequences. A storage facility opening a unit isn't just about collecting possessions. It triggers liability concerns, potential discovery obligations, and, in cases involving high-profile names, legal scrutiny from attorneys, PR representatives, and sometimes even courts. Imagine a chain reaction where the first link is a simple past due notice, and the last link is a room full of lawyers, investigators, and witnesses staring at items they never expected to see. That's what unfolded. The first step, as per standard procedure, was to notify the unit's renter or their legal representatives. But here, the ordinary became extraordinary yet again. Sources suggest that the notice either never reached its intended recipient or, if it did, it was ignored. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps due to oversight. Either way, the facility had the legal authority to open the unit. And when they did, they discovered a scene that left everyone questioning the chain of events that led there. One of the most perplexing aspects of this legal trigger is timing. Why now? Why not years earlier when the unit first slipped into irregular payment status? This is not merely a question of financial responsibility. It's a question of opportunity and intent. Could the timing have been anticipated? Was someone expecting or hoping that the process would unfold in this exact sequence? Sources close to the situation say that when the legal notice was issued, there was immediate internal discussion among advisors and attorneys. Questions were raised about privacy, risk, and potential fallout. The decision to proceed wasn't taken lightly. High-profile individuals are rarely subjected to the ordinary processes that affect the general public. Protocols are adjusted. Alerts are raised. Precautions are put in place. But this time, the law moved faster than any intervention could prevent. When the unit was finally scheduled to be accessed, the team present wasn't just facility staff. They were supplemented by legal observers, investigative consultants, and a small cadre of trusted witnesses. Their job was to ensure that every step complied with regulations while also documenting anything unexpected. And yet, as the door rolled up, it became immediately clear that unexpected barely scratches the surface. What made this legal trigger so remarkable wasn't merely the act of opening a unit. It was the implication that legal systems, routine, neutral, and seemingly mundane, could be the mechanism that exposes secrets no one else could. A law that exists to ensure fairness and accountability inadvertently became the instrument of revelation. Here's a thought to consider. How many moments in life are determined by things so banal that we almost miss their significance? A letter sent, a payment delayed, a signature overlooked. In this case, those small actions, or inactions, set in motion an event with consequences far beyond financial responsibility. The legal trigger also introduced tension that would influence every second that followed inside the unit. Witnesses describe a palpable awareness that they were not just observing a procedural opening. They were entering a space now charged with legal and moral responsibility. Every box, every label, every anomaly had implications, and every decision made in that room could be scrutinized, challenged, and potentially used as evidence in multiple forums. One source, a legal consultant familiar with high-profile cases, described the atmosphere as an intersection of curiosity and caution. Every action was deliberate, every sound measured, not because anyone expected confrontation, but because everyone understood the stakes. Legal exposure can escalate quickly, especially when the unit contained items of personal, financial, or potentially reputational significance. Questions that seemed abstract outside the room suddenly became urgent. Had everything been preserved with intent? Were their materials deliberately placed to mislead or protect? And crucially, what could happen if the wrong eyes interpreted what they found? Interestingly, the legal mechanism also affected human behavior. People who might have otherwise acted impulsively found themselves cautious, restrained, deliberate. Lawyers reminded investigators to photograph rather than touch. Observers whispered instead of speaking aloud. And even casual facility staff moved with a quiet tension that was almost theatrical, the kind of pressure that builds when an ordinary process becomes extraordinary without warning. What made the situation even more dramatic was the realization that this unit had never been truly private. In the public imagination, storage units are anonymous, faceless, ignored. But the reality is more complex. Each transaction, each lease, each procedural action is recorded. Each opens doors, not just to physical spaces, but to potential scrutiny. And this is where the law, usually a neutral observer, became an active player in the drama. The irony is almost poetic. A legal system designed to enforce rules and prevent chaos instead became the instrument that revealed a controlled, hidden narrative. The opening, triggered by routine procedure, exposed the carefully curated chaos of a life hidden behind public appearances. The same law that maintains order had, unintentionally, disrupted the story as it had been told to the world. Sources also reveal an internal debate that took place once the unit was legally accessible. Should they proceed cautiously and limit exposure? Or should they document everything thoroughly, regardless of potential fallout? The decision to act comprehensively ensured that the entire scene was captured, photographed, cataloged, and meticulously noted. Every nuance, every minor detail, was recorded for review. In hindsight, this decision was critical, because the legal trigger didn't just open a door, it opened a window into a reality that few were prepared to confront. By the time the first sweep of documentation was complete, the implications were clear. This was no longer about storage or payments. This was about narrative control, legal oversight, and the thin line between public perception and private reality. The law had set the stage, and the consequences were unfolding faster than anyone could predict. And then came the first hint, that even more complications were ahead. An item, an envelope, a folder, something small but deliberately placed, caught the attention of one of the observers. Its presence didn't just raise questions about content, it raised questions about intent. Why was it there? Who placed it? And why had no one noticed it before? That simple discovery prompted the first calls. Phones were quietly pulled out. Advisors contacted legal counsel. Observers whispered to each other in urgent tones. And yet, the atmosphere remained calm, almost eerily so. The calm before a storm. This legal trigger. The overdue notice, the procedural right to access, the small piece of paper that unlocked months, even years, of secrecy, had done what no gossip, no media speculation, no rumor mill could. It had forced exposure. And it had done so with the impartial authority of law, not the sensationalism of headlines. But here's the key point. This is not the end of the story. The legal trigger set the stage. It opened the door, literally and metaphorically. And what came next? The contents of the unit, the contradictions, the questions raised, would take everything to a new level. Because the law can compel access. It can authorize procedure. It can enforce accountability. But it cannot predict what will be revealed once the door is open. And according to sources, once that door rolled up, the room held surprises that went far beyond the expectations of everyone involved. Not chaos, not scandal in the traditional sense, but revelations that challenged timelines, narratives, and assumptions. The legal trigger was just the beginning, the moment that unlocked possibilities nobody had imagined. And as the team stepped inside, poised and cautious, they had no idea that what awaited them would demand judgment, interpretation, and perhaps even secrecy of a different kind. Time behaves strangely in moments of discovery. Seconds stretch. The air feels thicker. Every movement carries weight far beyond its physical significance. That's exactly what witnesses reported during the first minutes inside Meghan Markle's California storage unit. The door had been lifted. Light spilled across rows of boxes, dust motes floating in the thin sunbeams. But the room didn't breathe life. It seemed to hold its own. A stillness, oppressive yet expectant, filled the space. For those stepping inside, it was immediately apparent. This wasn't just a collection of belongings. It was a preserved narrative, a carefully arranged series of items that seemed almost to demand attention. No one rushed in. No one lunged toward the boxes. Observers paused at the threshold, hesitant to disturb what felt like a carefully constructed scene. The first step inside was deliberate, cautious. Every footfall on the concrete floor echoed, a reminder that this was not an ordinary storage unit. The first impression was one of order. Boxes stacked neatly, labels written in clean handwriting, some in ink, others printed, with dates, initials, or cryptic notations. Some boxes had been reinforced, others wrapped in plastic. Even small containers seemed placed with intention. There was no chaos here. There was purpose. Witnesses later described their initial reactions in the same way, a mixture of disbelief and tension. Not shock at what they could see, but at the fact that such a scene existed in a space meant to be mundane. It was the difference between walking into a junk-filled garage and entering a room designed to silently communicate a story without a word being spoken. The air carried faint odors, not decay, not rot, but the unmistakable scent of stillness. Dust had settled on horizontal surfaces, but certain areas were remarkably clean, as if someone had moved items strategically, creating pathways of access while leaving others untouched. Even small details. The angle of a box, the tilt of a stack, the way a folder rested on top of another, seemed deliberate. And then came the first hint that what they were seeing might contradict public narratives. Some of the labeled boxes contained dates that did not align with known events. Some materials appeared to predate or post-date events in ways that raised immediate questions. According to sources, observers began quietly whispering to each other, connecting details like pieces of a puzzle, unsure whether to speak aloud. It was here that the first emotional spikes occurred. Not panic, but tension. Witnesses describe heart rates rising subtly, hands tightening on clipboards and phones, eyes scanning the room in rapid sweeps. The anticipation of discovery is almost more powerful than discovery itself. You know something is significant, but you don't know why or how. Observers also noted patterns emerging almost immediately. Certain boxes were grouped by themes, documents, personal effects, memorabilia, while others seemed deliberately isolated. One small stack, located in the far corner of the unit, drew disproportionate attention. Items there had been arranged with meticulous precision, creating a sense of hierarchy or priority. According to sources, some investigators even stepped back, heads cocked, analyzing placement and context before touching anything. The team followed a cautious protocol. Photographs were taken before items were moved. Notes were meticulously recorded. Nothing was handled impulsively. In high-profile cases, mishandling evidence can have legal consequences. But in this case, it also ensured that the narrative embedded in the arrangement could be observed and interpreted before interference altered it. Witnesses described the scene almost like entering a museum curated by an invisible hand. Each box, container, and folder seemed to communicate silently, yet powerfully. Observers were aware that this was more than just belongings. It was a narrative in storage form, waiting to be understood. Then there were anomalies. Small but persistent. A container that looked out of place. A folder misaligned with the others. An envelope sticking out of a stack in a way that seemed deliberate yet cryptic. Observers reportedly paused at these points, instinctively sensing that these items were intended to draw attention. At the same time, the psychological tension increased. The first minutes inside the unit were a combination of awe and apprehension. Observers alternated between examining items closely and stepping back to take in the broader picture. This oscillation between micro and macro views is common in investigations where the scene itself communicates as much as the contents. One particularly striking detail, according to sources, involved the labeling system. Some labels appeared consistent with past timelines, while others directly contradicted public accounts. In one instance, an observer noted a date that predated a publicly known event by months, causing immediate speculation. Was this an oversight? A deliberate misdirection? Or evidence of something previously unknown? Witnesses also describe a silent understanding in the room. Every action mattered. Touch the wrong item. Misinterpret a detail. Speak aloud carelessly. The weight of potential consequences hung heavily, even though they had no official way of knowing the significance yet. The atmosphere, according to insiders, was surreal. Not in the sense of something fantastical, but in the sense of a moment suspended between reality and implication. Time seemed to slow. Conversations became whispers. Phones were out, but only for documentation. Eyes darted from box to box, scanning, reading, connecting dots. Questions arose almost immediately. Why were certain items placed where they were? Who arranged them? Why had these items been preserved instead of discarded? And most pressingly, what message, if any, was being conveyed by the deliberate order and labeling? Even as the team began cataloging what they could see, a deeper realization emerged. This was no ordinary storage unit. It was curated. It was intentional. It was meant to communicate something. Whether to future observers, investigators, or others, that purpose remained unclear, but it was undeniably present. And yet, as meticulous as the initial examination was, observers knew that they were only seeing the surface. Not all boxes had been accessed. Not all folders had been opened. Not all anomalies had been explained. According to multiple accounts, there were areas of the unit deliberately obscured or difficult to reach, creating a sense that the most important pieces were still hidden, waiting to be discovered. By the time the first 20 minutes had passed, the initial awe had begun to give way to anticipation. Observers sensed that they were at the threshold of revelations that would challenge assumptions, contradict expectations, and raise questions about events previously thought settled. It was in these first minutes that the silent tension reached its first peak. The legal trigger had opened the door. The room had revealed hints of order, contradictions, and careful placement. But the full story, the implications, the narrative, the surprises, had yet to emerge. And just as the team began to feel a tentative understanding, one observer reportedly noticed a folder in the corner, slightly askew, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was small, unassuming, almost deliberately easy to overlook. And in that instant, a sense of foreboding passed through the room. Because, as witnesses later confirmed, that folder was not just another item. It was the first piece that would escalate the discovery from curious intrigue to serious consequence. The first minutes inside the storage unit had already set the tone. Silence, tension, careful observation. But it was in the next stage, when the team began to examine and catalog the contents, that the real unease began to take shape. According to sources, there were items in the unit that simply did not belong, not in the sense of disorder or misplacement, but in the sense that their presence raised immediate and unsettling questions. Imagine walking into a space you expect to contain personal effects, clothes, memorabilia, perhaps some furniture, and discovering objects that suggest histories, timelines, and connections that contradict everything publicly known. That's what the witnesses described. Every box opened seemed to deepen the mystery. Every folder lifted seemed to expand the narrative in ways that defied expectation. The first anomalies were subtle. A document folder labeled with a date that didn't align with any public events. A container that appeared organized not chronologically, but by some other hidden system. Observers noted that these details were small enough to be overlooked by an untrained eye, but for investigators and legal representatives, they were glaring. They implied intention. They implied foresight. And, perhaps most troublingly, they implied that someone knew this space would eventually be seen by others. Then there were items whose very presence seemed out of place, not in a sensational sense, but in a procedural one. Certain materials were preserved in ways that suggested they had value beyond the ordinary. Some were placed in protective sleeves. Others were wrapped or reinforced, as if the person storing them anticipated scrutiny. Observers describe this as the kind of preparation you do when you expect someone else to look, and you want them to see only what you intend. Witnesses reportedly exchanged tense glances as they cataloged these objects. One legal consultant quietly whispered that the presence of these items could complicate the unit's legal handling, raising questions about ownership, intent, and potential exposure. A seemingly mundane space had become a nexus of uncertainty, and every detail mattered. But it wasn't just the physical objects that were alarming, it was what they implied. The careful organization, the chronological discrepancies, and the very act of preservation suggested a level of planning that went beyond casual tidiness. Sources described the effect as almost psychological. The observers weren't just cataloging items. They were interpreting a narrative hidden within them. Each box, each folder, each container seemed to tell a story, but not a story anyone had expected to read. Then came the first item that truly escalated the tension. A small envelope, tucked behind a larger box, unmarked except for a single initial. It seemed insignificant, almost deliberately easy to overlook. But when it was carefully opened, witnesses say, the reaction in the room shifted. Eyes widened, whispers began, and the first murmurs of disbelief spread. According to sources, this was the moment when the routine inventory became an event charged with legal and reputational weight. Observers quickly realized that some of the materials were inconsistent with prior public records. Timelines didn't match. Notations on folders conflicted with known events. Even objects that appeared ordinary, books, letters, small personal items, contained subtle details that challenged established narratives. And while nothing was overtly scandalous, the implications were unmistakable. Someone had been meticulous in controlling what was stored, and perhaps even in controlling what might one day be discovered. Witnesses also noted patterns that seemed almost intentional. Certain items were grouped in ways that suggested thematic connections. Others were deliberately isolated, set apart as if to draw attention or, conversely, to remain hidden until someone paid close attention. Observers described feeling as though the unit itself was communicating, silently guiding them toward, or away from, specific discoveries. Questions began to multiply. Why were these items preserved in this manner? Who had organized them and why? Was this a form of private archive, or a deliberate attempt to shape a future narrative? Every observer in the room had their own theory, but all agreed on one point. The unit was not ordinary, not in any sense that could be ignored. Then, according to sources, came an object that caused a collective pause. A folder labeled with a date that directly contradicted a widely reported public event. It wasn't dramatic at first glance, but its presence forced immediate reconsideration of established timelines. Observers began cross-referencing what they were seeing with known facts, whispering to one another, and taking extensive notes. The unit had become a puzzle, and the pieces didn't fit the way anyone expected. At this point, it became clear that the team was dealing with more than just stored belongings. They were encountering a curated collection designed to communicate, to preserve, and perhaps even to mislead. Each item carried potential significance. Every label, every placement, every layer of protection suggested an awareness of future scrutiny. The atmosphere in the room, already tense, grew heavier. Observers described the feeling as a combination of anticipation and apprehension. There was excitement, certainly, the thrill of discovery, but also the weight of responsibility. Every decision, every handling of an item, could have consequences, not just for legal proceedings, but for reputation, narrative, and perhaps even personal accountability. And yet, despite the meticulous cataloging and cautious handling, it was impossible to ignore a growing sense of foreboding. The items weren't just out of place, they were hints, clues, signals that something larger, more consequential, was embedded within this seemingly mundane unit. By the time the team had finished their initial sweep, one reality was undeniable. These items had been preserved with intention. And that intention, though not immediately apparent, suggested planning that extended far beyond ordinary storage. Observers began to speculate on who might have organized this, why, and whether the full scope of the contents would ever be revealed. Finally, just as the initial cataloging concluded, one observer noticed a subtle discrepancy. A box that had seemed innocuous at first glance was slightly misaligned with the others. Its label was partially obscured, and its placement suggested deliberate concealment. That simple detail, almost imperceptible, sent a ripple of concern through the room. According to insiders, it was the first clear indication that the most significant discoveries had yet to surface. Once the team had begun to catalog the unit's contents, it quickly became clear that something more perplexing was at play. Not only were there items that shouldn't have been there, but the very arrangement of these items created contradictions that no one could easily reconcile. What appeared orderly on the surface masked a deeper, more unsettling complexity. Observers reported noticing immediate inconsistencies. Some boxes were labeled with dates that seemed to predate known events in Meghan Markle's public life. Others contained personal items that, according to timelines, should have been elsewhere. A document folder might bear a year, yet contain items suggesting a different month entirely. To the untrained eye, these might seem minor, but for investigators, the implications were profound. Every inconsistency suggested a hidden narrative, a story intentionally obscured from public view. One legal consultant quietly whispered to an associate that the unit read like a timeline rewritten in miniature. Certain items, when placed in juxtaposition, contradicted everything previously understood. For example, objects labeled as 2015 appeared next to items associated with events in 2017. Personal effects and memorabilia overlapped in ways that made chronological sense only if someone had deliberately rearranged them. This wasn't casual storage. It was curated, intentional, and designed to provoke questions. Even the smallest details contributed to confusion. The labeling system, for instance, was inconsistent. Some labels were neatly printed with dates and initials, others handwritten, almost carelessly. Observers later speculated whether these differences were intentional, a code, perhaps, or a means of signaling importance to certain items while de-emphasizing others. Each inconsistency seemed to invite deeper scrutiny, almost daring the viewer to make sense of what was clearly meant to be ambiguous. Then came the first real shock. A set of folders that, according to public records, should not have existed in that context. The documents referenced events, people, and timelines that were either disputed or never publicly confirmed. Investigators reported that even opening one of these folders caused immediate debate in the room. What did it mean? How reliable was it? Could it be reconciled with publicly available information, or was it evidence of something previously hidden? As observers worked through the items, the contradictions multiplied. Boxes that appeared routine at first glance contained anomalies that grew more striking with each inspection. A small trinket, a photograph, or a folded note could disrupt the perceived order of the unit entirely. According to sources, investigators began mapping the unit's contents on whiteboards, trying to align timelines and make sense of conflicting data. But the more they tried, the more contradictions emerged. And yet, it wasn't just the content itself that caused confusion, it was the intent behind it. The meticulous preservation, the deliberate placement, and the carefully written labels suggested forethought. Someone had not merely stored items, they had controlled their arrangement to convey, or obscure, a narrative. Each contradiction seemed less accidental and more like a challenge to anyone attempting to interpret the unit's story. Observers reported that these contradictions created tension not only intellectually but emotionally. The psychological weight of seeing familiar names, dates, and events represented in unexpected ways provoked a mixture of fascination and unease. Whispered conversations filled the room as the team tried to reconcile what they saw with what they knew, or thought they knew, about the public narrative. Adding to the complexity, some boxes appeared to contain items intentionally concealed within other containers. Investigators noted that certain folders were placed inside protective sleeves or envelopes, obscuring details that might have been visible at first glance. Others were stacked so that their labels faced inward, hidden from immediate view. This deliberate concealment suggested awareness that someone would eventually access the unit, raising questions about intent and foresight. As the contradictions became more apparent, observers began to ask deeper questions. Was this arrangement meant to protect sensitive materials? Was it intended to mislead? Or was it simply a reflection of a chaotic personal archive that no one expected to be scrutinized? No definitive answers emerged immediately, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. This was not a simple storage unit. It was a complex puzzle. Then, according to insiders, the first potentially explosive discrepancy was discovered. A folder labeled with a past year contained items suggesting connections to current events. The room fell silent. Even those accustomed to handling high-profile materials reportedly froze, realizing that the implications could extend beyond personal curiosity. Some items, observers noted, could challenge existing public timelines if their authenticity were verified. The contradictions didn't end there. Small details, handwritten notes, minor documents, or labels continued to generate questions. Why did some items appear deliberately misdated? Why were certain objects grouped together despite apparent thematic irrelevance? Observers began speculating about the possibility of intentional obfuscation, though no conclusions were drawn publicly. The unit, they realized, had been carefully curated to be more than storage. It was a statement, a narrative, and a test of perception. Observers also described a growing sense of psychological pressure. The contradictions created a feedback loop. The more inconsistencies were discovered, the harder it became to interpret the unit rationally. Every decision about how to handle an item carried increased weight. Could moving a folder out of sequence alter the story it was telling? Could mislabeling during documentation create further confusion? The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of curiosity, anxiety, and anticipation. Amid the contradictions, a sense of urgency began to emerge. The team realized that the storage unit was not merely a passive archive, but an active source of potential evidence. If these items were presented publicly, they could reshape narratives, challenge assumptions, and prompt intense scrutiny. This realization added pressure to the already fraught process of cataloging, photographing, and documenting each item meticulously. Finally, as the team worked through the initial contradictions, one small but striking discovery set off alarm bells. A folder containing personal correspondences, dated in a way that directly conflicted with public accounts, was found near the back of the unit. The placement, partially hidden and deliberately angled, suggested intentional concealment. Observers immediately recognized the significance. The most sensitive materials were not at the front of the unit but tucked away, awaiting discovery by those who knew to look carefully. The contradictions, observers realized, were only the beginning. The placement, organization, and subtle details suggested layers of narrative still hidden. And as the team prepared to delve deeper, a sense of foreboding settled over the room. Because what had begun as a simple routine procedure, triggered by unpaid fees and legal paperwork, was fast evolving into a discovery with implications far beyond anyone's expectations. Among the neatly stacked boxes and folders, tucked into a shadowed corner, sat an envelope so unassuming it could have been overlooked entirely. Plain, manila, with nothing more than a single initial scrawled in black ink. It seemed insignificant. But in moments like these, appearances are deceiving. According to witnesses, the envelope became the pivot point of the entire discovery. It was first noticed by one of the legal observers. At first, it appeared ordinary, a small piece of paper tucked behind a larger folder. The hand reached out, paused, and then slowly lifted it from its resting place. Time seemed to slow. Cameras clicked. Notes were taken. And then, as the envelope was carefully opened, the room collectively held its breath. Inside, observers reported finding documents that contradicted everything previously understood about timelines, interactions, and private matters. The first page alone caused the murmurs to begin. Small, precise handwriting detailed information that, if accurate, reshaped public perceptions. The envelope contained a mixture of letters, notes, and what appeared to be personal memos. Each item, meticulously preserved, seemed intended for discovery, though not by just anyone. According to multiple sources, the documents inside were specific and damning, not in a sensationalized, scandalous way, but in a way that raised critical questions. Names were referenced, events recontextualized, and certain timelines were rewritten in a way that suggested careful planning. Observers whispered to one another, connecting these details with the contradictions already discovered in the boxes and folders. The story the unit told was becoming clearer, yet more unsettling. What made the envelope so powerful was its implications. Each document wasn't just a note or a piece of paper. It was a breadcrumb in a trail that suggested awareness and foresight. Whoever had curated these materials had anticipated someone would eventually examine the unit. Each item had a subtle purpose, as though carefully laid out to guide a viewer towards certain conclusions while obscuring others. Observers described the envelope as the first true confirmation that the unit wasn't simply a storage space. It was a narrative. And that narrative wasn't idle. It was charged with potential consequences, legally, personally, and publicly. The first document that drew attention was a handwritten note detailing a series of personal decisions that didn't align with public accounts. Observers leaned closer, whispering to each other, trying to determine the authenticity and relevance. It wasn't dramatic in a visual sense, but the emotional weight in the room was tangible. People instinctively felt that what they held in their hands was important, far beyond the ordinary significance of stored papers. A second piece, tucked behind the first, contained annotations and dates that contradicted well-known events. Observers began cross-referencing, using devices and notes, trying to match these revelations with established public timelines. And each time they thought they had found a pattern, the next item introduced a contradiction, a subtle twist, a hidden complexity that demanded attention. Even small details were meaningful. Margins contained initials, shorthand notes, and underlined phrases. Observers noted the deliberate nature of these markings, interpreting them as potential guides to understanding or even intentional misdirection. Every line, every word, every stroke of the pen was significant. Witnesses reported a mix of fascination and tension. The envelope, though small, commanded attention because it contained clarity and chaos simultaneously. It clarified some inconsistencies while amplifying others. The room oscillated between understanding and confusion as observers pieced together the implications. By this point, the team understood that the envelope was not alone in its power. It connected to other items previously cataloged. A folder with conflicting dates, a container of personal effects, and an array of documents that, when considered together, suggested a carefully curated story. The envelope acted as a linchpin, linking disparate items and contradictions into a coherent, if disturbing, narrative. Emotional tension grew as observers realized the potential stakes. The contents weren't merely personal or mundane. They carried implications for public perception, potential legal scrutiny, and narrative control. Witnesses later described the moment as almost surreal, holding documents that recontextualized events in a way that no one outside the room could yet understand. A particular note inside the envelope drew immediate attention. According to sources, it referenced meetings, locations, and decisions in a way that conflicted with established public accounts. Investigators paused, whispered among themselves, and began meticulously documenting each line. The note was small, almost insignificant in size, yet its weight was enormous. The envelope also raised questions about intention. Why had it been left in such an obvious, yet partially hidden spot? Was it meant to be found? Was it left as a warning, a guide, or an archive? Observers speculated endlessly. One legal consultant remarked that the envelope's deliberate placement suggested strategic thinking, a sense that whoever curated the unit knew it would one day be opened. As more items were removed and examined, the tension in the room escalated. Observers realized that the envelope wasn't just a discovery, it was a turning point. The unit, once a static collection of items, now had a narrative thread emerging. A story was forming, one that demanded careful attention and precise handling. Then came the final, most unsettling realization. The envelope suggested connections to materials not yet accessed, items that could potentially be far more consequential. Observers exchanged glances, understanding that the most explosive discoveries might still be hidden deeper within the unit. By the time the envelope had been fully examined, one truth was undeniable. The storage unit was no longer a passive archive. It was a carefully orchestrated revelation. Every box, folder, and envelope contributed to a narrative that had been meticulously curated, intentionally arranged, and now, finally, exposed. And as the team looked to the far corners of the unit, one thought hung in the air. The envelope had revealed only the beginning. There were still layers, still secrets, and still discoveries that could shift everything known about what lay within those walls. By this point, the team had been inside the storage unit for over an hour. The envelope had been examined, the contradictions noted, and the observers were beginning to sense the depth of what they had uncovered. Yet no one was fully prepared for the next discovery, one that would send shockwaves through the room. At the far end of the unit, beyond the neatly stacked boxes and carefully labeled containers, a section of the floor appeared uneven. Nothing seemed overtly out of place, just a slight bulge beneath a stack of containers, the kind of irregularity most people would miss. But trained observers noticed it immediately. Something was hidden beneath. Something that hadn't been documented in the preliminary sweep. With deliberate care, they began to remove the boxes covering the area. Each box lifted revealed another beneath it, smaller, yet heavier. Observers exchanged tense glances. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with anticipation. Every move was slow, meticulous. No one wanted to rush. What lay beneath could be more consequential than anything they had already seen. Finally, a crate came into view. Unlike the others, it was unmarked, plain, almost nondescript. There were no labels, no dates, nothing to indicate its contents. But the sheer weight of it made the team pause. Someone suggested using gloves and additional tools to carefully open it, aware that what lay inside could be sensitive, fragile, or potentially hazardous. When the lid was lifted, the room collectively froze. Observers describe a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and outright fear. Inside the crate were objects that were not just unusual, they were shocking. Not in a sensationalized way meant for headlines, but in a deeply disturbing and unexpected manner. Witnesses later described the scene as a silent, chilling revelation. The crate contained items that directly contradicted prior assumptions about the unit's purpose. Personal effects, documents, and memorabilia were there, yes. But layered among them were materials suggesting scenarios and associations that had never been publicly documented. Observers reported a palpable tension in the room as they realized the implications. These were not merely chronological contradictions or misplaced belongings. They were clues hinting at a reality hidden from public scrutiny. Among the items were artifacts that suggested careful preservation. Some were wrapped in protective plastic. Others had been reinforced with padding, as though the curator intended them to endure scrutiny over time. Observers interpreted this as a deliberate effort to ensure that these materials survived, kept intact for future discovery. But the most disturbing elements were those that appeared deliberately hidden. Certain objects were buried beneath layers of crates and folders, making accidental discovery unlikely. Observers described an eerie feeling that these items were intended for eventual discovery, but only by those who knew where to look. The implications were clear. Someone had curated this collection with foresight, control, and intention. Whispers filled the room. Observers debated the meaning of the findings, cross-referencing with the envelope and other items already cataloged. Each object removed from the crate seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The narrative embedded within the unit was becoming increasingly complex, suggesting motives, connections, and a hidden awareness that none of the observers had anticipated. According to sources, some of the most unsettling items were not overtly dramatic, but their presence carried an emotional weight. Small objects, folders, letters, personal mementos, were preserved in ways that implied significance far beyond their physical dimensions. Observers speculated that these materials contained hints of private decisions, hidden interactions, or previously undisclosed intentions. Then came the first truly alarming discovery. Beneath a layer of carefully stacked crates, an item emerged that observers described as unexpected and deeply troubling. It was small, almost inconspicuous, but its very existence raised immediate legal and ethical questions. Details were withheld by insiders for security and privacy reasons, but multiple sources confirmed that it fundamentally altered the perception of what the unit contained. As the discovery sank in, the team realized the full implications. The storage unit was not a passive archive. It was a controlled environment, curated